OG Rose, and today we're talking about exclusive, expensive, and inexpensive philosophy, which was inspired by the Net 75, and that's when we spoke with Javier Rivera and had this discussion on this kind of tension in philosophy where, on the one hand, we associate philosophy with kind of being abstract, disembodied, and having nothing to do with the real world. But then there's also a way in which it seems like without philosophy, you're in big trouble, because how can you even understand your worldview? How can you defend yourself from manipulation? There's certain skills that come with philosophy that seem ever more important in our globalized technological age. Furthermore, philosophy just seems to be that thing that happens if you think long enough. I think often when we say the word philosophy, we think the history of philosophy, like the study of Socrates, Plato, etc., etc. And you see, that's a very different thing, though, than the philosophy that just kind of follows from thinking, one premise to the next. If you say, I'm having a good day, what does good mean? What is a day? And you just go on and so forth. Like, philosophy in one way is just completely unavoidable and inevitable because you speak. And the moment you speak, you're using premises and definitions. And what do you mean by those definitions? And so on and so forth. I think very often when we speak of philosophy, we're speaking of the history of philosophy. Which is a confusion that seems more likely than if I say art. You don't automatically think art history, because art, we know, can be painting, certain skills, but the skills of philosophy are more invisible, they're more meta, and therefore it's easier to make the mistake of thinking that philosophy is the history of philosophy. All the same, even if you don't make that mistake, there seems to be forms of philosophy that are problematic, that disembody you, that pull you out of the real world, that makes you arrogant. And we read a lot of this with David Hume, and David Hume warns that when you enter into philosophy, you're separated from common life because you can't ground it anymore. You're no longer thoughtless. You start asking questions, and there's a certain melancholia. He talks about the philosophical melancholia is the way that the great Donald Livingston puts it. And so there's a kind of sadness that comes, and Hume talks like with the Human Treatise at the beginning, that comes from philosophy. And then in response to that melancholia, you're almost forced to kind of ascend. There's a philosophical ascent into greater philosophical insight. But then as you ascend, you can feel more and more entitled to rule and to control other people who are not philosophical, and then you get this kind of philosopher king who's always a philosopher tyrant and dictator, or very often at least. And so that's why for Hume, you have to return to common life, and philosophy has to embed itself in common life and defer to common life. If it does not, it becomes tyrannical. And it would seem as if the more and more, and then the argument of belonging again, is that today everyone is experiencing the philosophical ascent, philosophical melancholia, because globalization, pluralism forces philosophy. You're forced to encounter difference, because philosophy tends to start with the encounter of difference, and under pluralism, you're more and more forced to encounter difference, and so therefore you're more likely to be philosophical. So today, like Peter Berger says, today we're all existentialists now. And I agree, and so likewise, we're all forced to be philosophical, or we have to be fundamentalist, closed-minded, tribal, and turn to strong men, and that makes us susceptible to the banality of evil. But the point is that we see in Hume a conception of a good philosophy and a bad philosophy. And it's very difficult, though, to kind of explain what is good philosophy from bad philosophy, especially when you have all these kind of associations with philosophy as going to college, being in a bubble, and so on and so forth. A hope I have is that we might be moving into an age where it's easier to disconnect philosophy from abstraction, pure abstraction, if you will, being in a bubble, absent-mindedness, and so on and so forth. And that's basically thanks to the internet and Zoom in particular. If I wanted to do philosophy in the past, before the internet, I probably did have to, I needed to be elite. So the paper is going to make distinctions between elite, expensive, and inexpensive. Exclusive is actually the main, exclusive, expensive, and inexpensive. And really, like when we look at the Greeks, a lot of them didn't have to work. They had slaves, right? And they also kind of lived in a very local area, and they tended to know one another. So there was a sort of exclusivity to philosophy then. But as you kind of move through history, what ends up happening is doing philosophy. And what I'm saying about philosophy, please note, could apply to education in general. Well, philosophy then moves to the college. And you see, college as a logistic reality is kind of strange. It's very different from most of your life. It's kind of 4 years where you're around people your age. Most of your logistic realities are taken care of, and it feels like a bubble. It feels kind of disconnected from the real world. And that's the only place, and basically that's where you learn philosophy. And then if you want a job in philosophy, you're going to mostly and probably end up working at a university. And so more and more associations of philosophy and even education just go with college. Furthermore, there's a kind of exclusion that comes out of that, because if you can't go to college, it's as if you can't access philosophy. And it also feels very class-based, because often going to college feels class-based. I mean, the numbers still show that college is mostly organized according to class lines, no matter how much they may claim to try to make room for other classes. That doesn't seem to be in the numbers. And that would then mean the association. If philosophy, so you have these kind of associations. A lot of this paper is talking about associational logic. So you have an associational logic of philosophy with college, college with elite, college with exclusive. Therefore, philosophy is exclusive. Also, college is kind of disembodied, and it's kind of like a bubble, and maybe they're even arrogant, and maybe some of the working class are kind of bitter toward college because they think they're smarter than the working class. But then the colleges can be bitter toward the working class because they think the working class sees them as impractical, so you have some resentment there. And in that resentment being latent in the college question, where philosophy is associated with college, then there's a kind of resentment toward philosophy, and this association of it as being high, arrogant, disembodied, and so on and so forth. And indeed, that's a problem that we have seen in philosophy, and I would argue that it's the problem we've seen in all educational fields. Thomas Sowell, Paul Johnson, Julien Benda, they all warn of the intellectual class, how intellectualism, that you can always get this kind of vision of the anointed that emerges out of intellectualism. And perhaps philosophy can be one of the worst forms, because it can be about anything. I can generally philosophize about anything, and so maybe it's a more unbound form of that arrogance if it becomes arrogant. But the quality of arrogant, bad philosophy, there is forms of that in sociology, politics, I could go on. But to focus on philosophy, because perhaps that's the most consequential, because you can philosophize about anything, as Samuel Barnes talks about. The key is that arrogance also is tied to the logistic reality of the college system, and also the monopoly on credentials college has, which further worsens the resentment. But theoretically, you could have a plumber or a plowman reading Hegel. You could have a blue-collar worker who is actually doing, studying philosophy. That's not impossible. It just doesn't tend to happen today, because we think it's silly to read books if you're not writing a paper on them or you're getting a job. Like, we have these associational logics where learning outside of a career plan or doing it in your free time is silly. What's the point? And once you get that, then the only people for whom there's a point to read philosophy tend to be the people in college, which then just reinforces the idea of disconnect, disembodied, and privilege that philosophy has. And indeed, thought, we learn, as postmodernity stresses, thought tends to reflect socioeconomic reality. And so if all the philosophy is coming out of college, it tends to be, reflecting college interests. But my hope is, as we move, so again, to start with the Greeks, as a general paradigm, you have this kind of exclusive elite philosophy, and then you move to the expensive philosophy in college. But today, you might be moving toward inexpensive college, and I think this is a different socioeconomic paradigm that suggests we're going to get new philosophy, new thought, new education, new learning, and I have quite a lot of hope in it. I mean, yes, it costs money to have Zoom, the internet. You have to have time to watch YouTube videos on the liminal web, but it's cheaper. It's likely a lot of these people actually have side hustles, so they're probably not abstract, mindless people who don't know about the real world of real people and understand that philosophy has to be in service of them. So we have a new socioeconomic reality that easily will change the kind of thought we have, and that being the case, we have to be careful to continue thinking of philosophy exclusively in terms of its history and the associations it's garnered up through that history of being, say, disembodied, abstract, elite, and so on and so forth. Indeed, there is a bad philosophy, a very dangerous bad philosophy. But there is also a good philosophy, and the socioeconomic reality of inexpensive philosophy probably has a higher likelihood of being good. Not necessarily, but it probably has a higher likelihood of being good. And indeed, I don't mean to say that exclusive and expensive philosophy education can't give rise to insights that are only possible in exclusive and inexpensive socioeconomic conditions. It's perhaps philosophy can gain things out of those states that it can gain from nowhere else. And we shouldn't assume that inexpensive philosophy is necessarily better. It's probably just going to be different. But in that difference, it might be more creative and it might be better. But the key is with this new socioeconomic paradigm, we probably can actually leave behind or start moving out of previous associations of philosophy. And please note, you could say, well, wait, couldn't you always just go to a library and read philosophy? Wasn't it always inexpensive in a sense? You could always go to Barnes & Noble. Fair, but one of the key dimensions of philosophy is, and one, you can't do that if you don't have time, energy, as David Theory Underground talks about, so please note that. So a key is that, the college space gives you time, energy to study. But the other thing is that philosophy really comes out in conversation. And the likelihood of you encountering people at Barnes & Noble who have read a lot of philosophy or the same books you have and have similar interests is very, very low. And so there was probably a cap to how far you could advance in philosophical reasoning just by going to the bookstore. You need those conversations. And that's where college could help you, because you could be in a classroom with other people interested in the subject and thus have those discussions. And you could do that in an exclusive structure, because everyone in the gymnasium was interested in philosophy as well. But the problem is once you leave college, you lose that, and then it would seem like that's the end of your philosophical engagement. Well, this is the beauty of the liminal web, right? And this Zoom tradition. I'm also talk about and belonging again to the movement from oral tradition to written tradition to what seems to be a kind of Zoom tradition, as I was speaking with Cleo about, which also helps us understand that learning is not just being good at trivia, but the ability to participate in the flow of an unfolding and information where you don't know the answers ahead of time. I think that also transforms the association of educated from being good at trivia to being creative and able to think through problems live that have not been thought before. So this Zoom tradition that's emerging, that is probably also shaping the brain, because mediums shape the brain. It's also probably really transforming the human subjectivity in probably positive ways. Now, it also seems to fragment focus. If every new medium has new risks. The written word destroys memory, following that Plato story, right? And it would seem that the Zoom tradition can the internet destroys focus, and that's a huge problem. But it seems like it can also change the brain to be multidimensional, multi-perspectival, many of the things that meta-modern thinkers or like Layman Pascal will talk about. So that should be taken seriously. But the main thing is, with the Zoom tradition, it is possible to inexpensively simulate the college environment and have these philosophical discussions, and it's cheap. This being the case, lifelong learning might actually be possible. Like true lifelong learning might be possible, and we're probably going to need, basically being an autodidact may become necessary for survival, given AI and complexity. I would have to talk about that, but it might be more and more that being an autodidact is no longer optional. I wonder this. Certainly, though, at the very least, now that you have the Zoom tradition, the association of philosophy with privilege can start to break down, because you're going to have people on the liminal web that work, Dave works at the Amazon warehouse. There are lots of people that have blue-collar jobs. These are not peoples whose logistical realities are taken care of by privilege. They also work. But the very fact they also work probably means their philosophy is going to be more grounded. It's going to be less abstract. And so we should take that very seriously. And under that new socioeconomic paradigm, we will probably have new thought. Other things that can be said is, given these new technologies, we probably can move away from the resume to the portfolio. I don't really need to, we used to sort information by seeing what colleges people went to. Well, I can watch a YouTube video and see if you're competent or not, if you're qualified, right? So and I could make more examples, but there's this kind of movement possible now from the resume to the portfolio. Ivan Illich was big on taking down the system of credentials in favor of the quality of ability. If an engineer can fix a bridge, that should be what we judge more than his resume. Now, resume can still have a role, because it can help you kind of make an assessment of if you should take this risk, but ultimately it comes down to the quality of the job. And you'll have ways to determine qualification thanks to the Zoom technology that you otherwise could not have. And I think that's going to transform how the brain works. I think that could open doors where basically right now your life is determined by your early 20s, by what you did then. That no longer necessarily has to be the case. I mean, a 42-year-old single mom can't realistically go back to college, but she could maybe autodidactically learn skills in her own ability, and if she could offer her portfolio to prove her qualification, that could open a lot of doors. And the more doors that open, the more creative the thought, the more different the thought could be, and things like that. More could be said. The paper is also going to talk about the ramifications this would have for education. I will mention Mr. Frege's book on ontological design, which is invaluable. But mainly, I think there's a whole lot of kind of anti-intellectualism in America, in the West in general. I can't help but think part of that follows from the associational logic of where we basically kind of connect intellectualism with privilege and bubbles. The more we break that down, and the more also people see how engaging in philosophy can change your quality of experience and make your experiences more nutritious, as Layman Pascal puts it, I think more and more people, that anti-intellectualism can be broken down. But to the degree that occurs, or when it occurs, will be relative to the degree that we embrace the Zoom tradition, the new paradigm of philosophy, and speak accordingly. For more about this argument in the piece, please see Substack and Medium. And for more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so forth. And thank you so much for your time.